Right, okay. Now we're on to the question and answer stage now. This is your chance to partake in this afternoon's events. And so please all think up the sort of question you want to ask. And we're going to start now with our first questioner.
Jeff Deacon. You've spent a lot of time talking about having to rebuild policy, and by the sounds of things, you're describing a government in this country that has been hollowed out, that has no technical expertise, and has exported all its decision-making to other people, and then doesn't necessarily like the answer that comes back from them. Can you talk us through what sort of things might be necessary to rebuild our own expertise, to have our own policy, to achieve what we, the nation, want our policy to be?
It's an interesting perspective. There is a phenomenon which we had to deal with and still have to deal with the liberated former Soviet colonies. And it's a phenomenon known as absorptive capacity, where you can only move as fast in terms of reforms as your own administrative systems are capable of taking you. And yes, clearly, a lot of the expertise that was inbuilt and inherent within the civil service has been exported to Brussels. We no longer have trade as a competence that is now an exclusive competence of Brussels. So we have no people with recent expertise within the current civil service on how to negotiate trade deals. That's actually going to be an important factor in terms of our rehabilitation. But in another respect, I sketched out how the world is changing and how global bodies are making the regulation. And you're bringing in actually new strains and levels of expertise into the system as well, so that you, for instance, in the shipping domain, international shipping, big players in the regulatory systems are actually the shipping companies themselves. And you've got forums where they're able to bring in their expertise. We're bringing in the NGOs, bringing in all other strains of expertise. So the issue probably is not necessarily the ability to bring in expertise, but the accountability and the transparency. What worries me is there's an awful lot of going on without us being aware of it. Once we leave the EU, this will continue to go on. A lot of the law will continue, or standards will continue to be made at global level. But what we need is people that are able to provide oversight and translate and to open up for us the processes and make us more aware of what's going on, and to provide political oversight as much as anything else. And it's the political oversight which I think is missing from a lot of these things. So in that sense, I'm not too worried, but I would accept that yes, we are going to have to perhaps rebuild our university systems, which at the moment are being bought out by Brussels and providing policy advice to Brussels. We're going to have to reframe those. We're going to have to build new elements of expertise. Perhaps we might even have to build some new colleges for civil servants to cover specific areas. New examinations, new syllabuses to deal with the reality. And that's all part of this process where we're not going to be able to say, tomorrow we're going to have new policies. It's going to take a long, long time. And I did mention briefly that when you look at the fishing policy, you know, we used to have fishing laboratories in this country that don't exist anymore. Hull, you go where there used to be a research establishment, there's now a shopping mall. So all of this infrastructure, yeah, it's got to be rebuilt, and this is going to take a while. It's a problem.
Can I chip in on this?
Yes, of course.
That was a very good question. It's a very important question. It's one I wrote about rather despairingly a few months ago in my column. We had a very, what I was talking about was the way that you've got now a civil service, most of which, almost all the members of which, have grown up as part of this ever-growing network of government that is centred in Brussels. So you've got whole generations now of civil servants who have never actually, particularly in certain ministries, ever really had to think out for themselves a policy from scratch as to what would be best to solve a particular practical problem, because it's all coming into the system from outside. And the particular ministry that both Richard and I are very familiar with, for a particular reason, is the Department of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, as it's now laughably called.
Yeah.
Now, that ministry is very big, and almost everything it does
It's Brussels.
is from Brussels. So there is scarcely a person in that ministry who has ever had to think out a practical problem as to what's the right policy. Now, we did have a very interesting insight, this is why I wanted to chip in on this, as to what might be a part of an answer to the question. Because we had a good friend and, as it were, working colleague called Mr. Owen Patterson, who in practical terms, whatever his public persona may be, he is an incredibly effective, hands-on guy sitting round a table thinking out a problem. He's also much more of a Eurosceptic than probably most people realise, although he does speak very good French and German. So when he was in Brussels, he was actually much more effective than the average British minister in trying to work the Brussels system in the right directions. But the point being that Owen was he is a practical guy, and he could see all sorts of problems. I was very much involved in one particular one. How do you solve the problem of the terrible flooding in my county of Somerset? This was 2 years ago. Now the point is that this is why it's relevant to your question. When he got into that ministry, into the top position, he found that the people, all the officials around him, senior, middle and the rest, were all used to working in the Brussels system according to the consensus, etc. But he began to push in a number of directions, imaginatively and practically, trying to get people to do what we would be asking for if we became an independent country, which is to start thinking from scratch. Let's look at this problem. Let's look at the fact that half of Somerset's been underwater. What is the practical answer? Forget the fact that there's layers and layers of European legislation. What we want to do is to stop, A, hundreds of homes being flooded, and B, can we please save some of the wildlife that is being destroyed by the very floods which have been created by the following of Brussels legislation in favour of preserving wildlife? That was the complete farce of the Somerset floods of 2014. Owen was the one minister in the last decades who actually went in and tried to push some of his civil servants into thinking as civil servants would and should if we were once again an independent country.
So
and he was sacked by Mr. Cameron for being too good at his job.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for the first question. And now the next.
Thank you. I'm George Harlock. For my sins, I'm leading the Brexit charge in Milton Keynes. Don't get confused by the fact I'm wearing a Vote Leave t-shirt. Yesterday it was leave.eu. Well, I've got the lot. We're all of those brands and none of them. I'm leaving in tomorrow or Monday for a 3-day campaign on Holy Island in Northumberland, where I know more than 10% of the approximately 100 villagers from when I lived there as a child in 1956 to 58. I think I'll get a hearing. The objective of my reverse Viking raid there is to leave the island by Friday morning with 60% or more of the 100 or so houses and shops with some kind of Brexit sign in their window, and then call in the media. I'm going to give each and every remaining fisherman on the island this booklet, which I've just got today, My question is going to be to them, or are there any of them that have had a grant in recent years to build a new boat, and I know of at least one man there, would probably be staying at his wife's B&B. What if he says to me, okay, I've got this grant, it's come via the EU, whatever, because of that grant, I want to stay in. And then the supplementary question is, if we've succeeded when we leave on Friday morning to catch the tide and get home, how do we best call in the media to take advantage of what we've accomplished, if we accomplish it? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a big question, that. Farmers are asking it, fishermen are asking it, and of course a lot of the regional beneficiaries are asking it, what happens if we leave, what happens to the money? I think it's been rather unfortunate, the Leave programme trying to sell the idea that 350 million a week goes to Brussels. Of course it doesn't. The rebate has to be taken into account. There's then government receipts, which of course go to pay a small amount to CFP, a large amount to CAP, and that's about 2.9 billion. And then there's the regional funding. But then there's also the private sector payments, where Brussels actually pays separately and directly to individual contractors. And that's worth about 1.5 billion. So there's about, floating around there's about 4.5, 5, 6 billion, which actually goes back into the UK economy, which, if it was lost to the beneficiaries, would create a significant problem. And it's already creating a tension at the moment, as people say, you know, if we leave, we're going to lose that money. Well, that money basically has to be protected. You cannot, even if you don't agree with the funding streams, you cannot cut funding streams off overnight without serious difficulty for the people relying upon them. That especially applies to farmers. So we have to ensure politically, and that's really about people power and about expectations, that any funding stream currently in place will continue for the foreseeable future until such time as we're able to reorientate policy. If we don't, we're going to lose an awful lot of people. We're going to lose farming, we're going to lose most of the fishermen, and we're going to lose many, many others. And that's a big tranche of votes that we're not going to do. So yeah, that money's going to have to stay. It's going to have to be repaid. But it means that the amount of money available for redistribution is actually going to be very small indeed. Booker.
Right, I'll merely quote something that I think Richard and I have been saying for about 20 years now, which is, and this is very frivolous, of course. There are really only two sorts of people who believe that the European Union is a good thing, that we should stay in it. One is the large number of people who don't understand it at all. The other is the people who, in one way or another, are getting money from it. And that's an important question, which Richard has covered. End of frivolity, back to seriousness.
Well, interestingly, there's a big campaign from the universities at the moment who say they're getting a lot of money from Brussels and we should stay in the European Union just to get that money. Well, apart from the fact that it's only about 3% of the total research budget, so it's a very, very small amount. Traditionally, historically, universities have always been major drivers of policy research in the UK. The fact is that they're now doing policy research for the EU. A lot of this so-called research funding is actually policy research. I went through a lot of the last Framework 7, and I reckon something like 70% of the research projects in toto have a policy function or policy implications. Now, if we're rebuilding policy, then actually the amount of money from Her Majesty's government that is going to flow into universities is actually going to be very much higher than it is from Brussels at the moment. The universities stand to benefit. it was also quite interesting that 3 countries in Europe stand outside the EU CAP, Iceland, Switzerland, Norway, all 3 of which farmers enjoy very substantially higher subsidies and rural support than the countries within the CAP. So that there is a good reason or good evidence actually to support the idea that it's the EU that's actually holding back a lot of this payment system, and that we will see more money in certain respects in policy levels flowing into areas than we're seeing at the moment. So some of the beneficiaries will probably or could well do better now outside the EU than they're doing now. It's an odd thought there.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And can we go on to the next question, please?
Yeah, Ian Rhodes, representing myself. I'm from Wiltshire. A two-pronged question, really. I think, Richard, you've hit the nail on the head this afternoon when you've almost said, in not so many words, it's the economy stupid. And I think that's what will concern the vast majority of people that will vote in this referendum. I was just speaking to a gentleman here during the break, and I'm very much of the view that it's a very human thing that we walk into a voting booth, having heard all the arguments, pick up the pencil, pat our wallets, and then vote accordingly. I believe the Scots did that in their referendum. So what I want to ask you is to expand a little bit on, you laid out the mechanisms for withdrawing from the single market, for want of a better expression, and the alternatives that we've got there. And to be very fair to you, you said it ain't going to be easy, and it's very complicated. And I think that worries potential voters. And when it comes up with my mate in the pub, and I tell him about Eunice, that I've now learnt about this afternoon, and we get into it a little bit, how do I answer him when he says, cool, that sounds a bit complicated? I think I might remain, because, you know, it sounds like too much trouble. Or my friend who's got a very nice little house in southwest France, he says to me, well, I've got a house in France, so if we come out, does that mean I won't be able to get there? Yes. And will they nick my house back off me and things like that? And I think these are the questions that we're going to have to answer on the ground and get it down to a level that relates it to people's individual situations, and that's the way we're going to have to win hearts and minds. It's a very long question, stroke statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. I did a version of this talk in Dawlish, and perhaps I should have started it off the same way. I asked people mentally to make a comparison between a 1950s handheld telephone, the plug-in, well, they didn't even plug them in, they were permanently wired in then, and then the simplicity of an ordinary telephone with its dial and its big receiver, which your handset, which you held up, but the simplicity of that piece of machinery, which just had a microphone, an earpiece, and a very simple dialing mechanism. And now contrast with a smartphone that you will get today, which is a mini computer with functions that would be unimaginable even 20 years ago. The idea that you could actually have a telephone conversation and look at the people over the screen at the same time, 20 years ago was science fiction. The point being is that actually things are a lot more complicated. In many ways to our enormous advantage. I can log on to, say, Amazon. I can click a button, one click, and order something from China direct. And in 10 days, it's come through my letterbox at an extraordinary price. And the infrastructure that's gone behind this demands an extremely complex, sophisticated governance. Now, you can stand back and basically whinge and say, oh, you know, things are so complicated, I don't understand them. But I'm sorry, actually, governance is complicated now. And therefore, we have to look at new systems. We cannot rely on 18th, 19th century. When you think of it, the European Union is based on a customs union, which was actually, the model for which was the German Zollverein, which was when? 1833.
I stand to be correct.
1848, so somewhere around.
1833.
19th century technology, 200 years ago. We have to move on. And when people say, oh, well, this is complicated, well, sorry, yes, it is. It's the real world. We are able to buy goods from countries which 40 years ago weren't even producing them. We're able to jump on aeroplanes at a cost which is so phenomenally low, it's staggering, to go places that you would have had to be enormously wealthy and spend months getting there sometimes. And all of these attributes of a modern world that we can talk to friends and relatives in Australia with ease, at no cost over Skype, and do all these unimaginable things that haven't actually happened by accident. Booker earlier was saying that, you know, he can go to India and you can go into a shop, if you say you've got your flash gun for your camera and you want AAA batteries, you can go into that shop and you say, I want a AAA battery. And you will get a AAA battery and you will put it in your machine, which was actually made probably in South Korea, but made from components which came from Japan, some from Europe, some from Indonesia, which have all been flown round the world, assembled, put together, and sold for you for pittance in terms of what you'd been paying 30, 40, 50 years ago. That you can now buy computer components or buy a whole computer for a fraction of the cost of even years ago that was built. That you can buy cars which are now incredibly safe, incredibly good value, which are made now with an average, they say, a basic saloon car has about 10,000 different types of component in it.
Richard, everything you say is right and brilliant, but the question, actually, there's another half to the question.
Yeah.
How do you explain? We all accept that everything's got far more complicated. No one knows that better from the inside than you do. What you heard this afternoon from Richard was a brilliant tour de force where he makes one of the most boring subjects trigger laughter.
Yeah, indeed.
But the questioner asked, how do you explain to man in pub, man on doorstep, guy you meet in the train, that all this complexity, like the iPhone, you don't understand how it works inside. All you see is the outside. And that's what the man or woman, or indeed whatever sex you like, going into the ballot box on the 23rd of June, it comes down to what you're seeing at the front of the iPhone rather than understanding all the complexities inside.
Well, the answer,
that's the battle we've got.
Well, but Booker, the answer is actually quite simple. Do you want a wind-up Bakelite phone for your government, or do you want a smartphone government?
I can't see that winning many votes in what is called the dog and tag.
The point is exactly that, is that the European Union is based on a 200-year-old concept. It's 18th, 19th century, 20th century at best governance. We had this little joke that it's not actually strictly true, but it sounds too good to miss, is that all of the signatories of the original Treaty of Rome would have qualified for a bus pass. There was actually two that wouldn't have. But it was an old man's treaty based on concepts of a century before. We need modern governance, modern treaties, modern ways of doing things to deal with a complicated world. So do you want old-fashioned 19th, 20th century governance, Or do you want to set yourself up for the 21st century where you can buy goods of extraordinary range, extraordinarily cheaply, and you can go anywhere in the world very, very simply, cheaply, easily? Or do you want to be stuck in this old, antiquated
Richard,
construct?
Everything you say is usually right.
But
I would have loved to have seen Richard doing his presentation this afternoon, a whole day, and he does what he did this afternoon with David Cameron and George Osborne and all the rest of those little non-entities that they've got together, sitting there, and then see if you can have an interesting dialogue. Because most of what Richard said, they wouldn't have a clue about. They'd never heard of Eunice. I thought Eunice was a pop singer in the 50s. No, I mean, what Richard is saying is incredibly important, but we are looking at the inside of the iPhone, not the question I was asking, how do we boil all this down into something that can be grasped? You can't go into a pub and give a 6-minute lecture or a 10-minute lecture on Eunice, because the eyes will glaze over. But what you can do is try to find, Richard, a simple way of boiling all that complexity down so you don't have to look at the inside of the iPhone and you've got a message to tell people.
well, I don't think you can, Booker. I think what happens, and this is why I'm more than a little bit worried about this referendum, is we have lost the art of political discourse. I remember at the time of very, very tense in Israel, just through the war of attrition, where they'd introduced SAM missiles in Egypt, and Israeli fighters were flying over, and they lost in very, very short order several Phantoms. And sitting in a bus in Tel Aviv, just talking with friends, and being told to shut up by other passengers in the bus as the whole bus went quiet to listen to the news. In a nation that took their politics very seriously because serious things were happening to them and because politics to them were important. And there is an element here is that no, you cannot simplify everything to the nth degree, and you cannot trivialize it, and you cannot turn everything into a Janet and John discussion. People themselves, in a functioning democracy, have got to begin to grow up and take responsibility for their own governance and their own their own role in government. And a democracy has to, in order to be a functional democracy, must have people who are prepared to actually take part in it. And this is what worries me, is we've infantilized a lot of our politics. We've dumbed it down. There is no answer to that, Booker. People have got to actually address these issues, because if they don't, they're going to suffer for them.
Yeah, you can't see it on the telly.
No, yeah, exactly.
I mean, if I'm allowed to give my four pennyworth on this, on the trade issue, it is very complicated, yes, and people should be made to think. But having said that, I find the simple way of explaining the advantages of leaving the EU are that we will sit at the top table where the decisions are made, and you covered that in your presentation very, very clearly. And so that is the advantage, that is the man in the street simple explanation, that we will sit at the top table rather than be represented by an EU official. And that, I think, covers one of the points you're making, I hope.
Yeah,
I couldn't agree more. I've got one advantage over you lot, or possibly it is an advantage, but a lot of what Richard comes to, all his thinking and facts and things, I get it down the telephone for an hour.
Yeah. Well, I get it for half an hour, so yeah. Well, every night, yeah.
But of all the points that he's made thousands of points to me, many of which I thought, wow, is that really right? Yes, it is. But the point you're making is one that really does weigh, and is actually quite simple to explain if you're given 2 minutes as opposed to just 10-second soundbite.
Yes.
The top table is incredibly important.
Yeah.
The fact that we are just one of 28 states.
Yeah, rather than be represented at the table on a fishing matter by a Spaniard, we will be represented by ourselves at Codex. I mean, by a British official.
Big tick.
Yeah.
And anyone actually could grasp that, apart from David Cameron.
Well, he doesn't, yes. Okay, can we move on to perhaps the next question then, please?
Hello, Roland Smith, Adam Smith Institute. My question concerns the globalisation, global bodies angle. In fact, it's probably two questions, actually. So one of the things I get back quite often is that the global law, the global rules, once they come through the EU, they aren't really global laws anymore because they have put their own spin on it. And therefore transformed it into something subtly but importantly different. And therefore that obviously queers the pitch for us, the UK, in arguing that actually we're just going to adopt and observe global laws in future, and therefore we will still be able to operate in the single market. So that's one point. The other point is around the EU just being a very major player at global level, and actually that's why, or that's where we get our, where the importance of the EU comes from at global level. That is quite often made as a riposte to our general argument around globalisation. I just wondered if you had any comments on both of those points.
Well, Booker and I, when in the early days when we were dealing with regulation from Brussels, we came across this phenomenon called gold plating.
It was originally called Bookerism.
Yes, indeed.
Eyesight is my... That came from Douglas Hurd in the House of Commons. This is an interpolation. I started to write about the way that Brussels directives, which might be 4 pages out of Brussels, would then turn into 80 pages of regulations by Whitehall. And I wrote about this in the Daily Telegraph. And I was told by my neighbour and then friend, who was a member of the Cabinet, you would be amazed to hear that that article was discussed for half an hour in Cabinet the other day, because none of the ministers round the table had been aware that the civil servants were adding on to the directives. In other words, the guys who were signing the regulations out of Whitehall weren't reading them, wouldn't read them, believed what the officials told them. Sorry, Minister, you've got 12 regulations you've got to sign this morning. They haven't got time to read them. This was the revolution in government which I was referring to earlier, which brought Richard and me together in the early 1990s, when we realised that the way in which the laws which affect all our lives were being made, the process was totally different from what it had been even 20 years before. Even in the 80s, you'd get 206, there was 1 year when 206 Acts of Parliament went through. 10 years later, the number of regulations had doubled, and the number of Acts of Parliament had been reduced from 206 to 24.
Yes. Yes.
That was the revolution that brought Richard and I together, and we're still at it together, for God's help us, 25 years later.
And
trying to explain to people that we live in a totally different world in that sense, as in so many others.
Well, it's exactly that thing that's happening at global level, is you're getting global standards, which then you get Brussels gold plating to become Brussels laws, which then goes, so the stuff we're getting from Brussels is actually global plus the Brussels gold plating. Now, a lot of the financial services regulation is very, very much like that. The point is, and it works to our advantage, is that if we're dealing direct, then we can take the global standard without the embellishments from Brussels. Now, we then get a situation where if Brussels want to embellish the law, they can do so, but they cannot treat entities, other countries that conform with a basic global standard. They cannot exclude them under WTO rules. They can produce procedural barriers. But if, for instance, our system, our financial systems are fully conform with, say, Basel III, but not with all the tiddles that they have added on, they would find it very, very difficult to exclude us. And on that basis, we would find allies with the rest of the world. I know Peter's been doing a lot of work, my son, on maritime politics. And the tendency of the European Union to add political elements to maritime law is much resented by the international shipping community. So that what we would find ourselves outside the EU, actually joining in with other nations and other global agencies in constraining and restricting Brussels' tendency to add on to global directives. Now, there's another very quick point here, is that some of it is gold-plated, but a lot of it isn't. A lot of the global stuff comes through not the Parliament and the Council through the standard legislative procedure, what's known as the ordinary legislative procedure, but comes through this strange system called comitology. And there's nothing can be changed. It actually comes straight through. It actually comes out of the system the other end without a vote, unchanged. And I remember Owen Patterson and I were working on a big problem about foreign lorries coming into this country with the offside mirrors wrongly positioned for British road conditions, and had this alarming habit of sort of mowing down cyclists because of the dead spot. We went to Brussels to talk about getting a new standard for mirrors and imposing a standard, a British standard on foreign truckers to make sure that their lorries were safe. Only for Brussels to say they couldn't do anything because they were waiting for UNIS to come out with a new standard. So in that respect, the more direct access we have to the global standards, the more control we actually have over Brussels, and the greater ability we have to actually prevent them gold plating and complicating the legislation and trading standards.
Okay, right, on to our fifth question, isn't it?
John Ashworth, Restore Britain's Fish. Please excuse me for not standing up. I've worked all my working life in the commercial fishing industry. I've seen at first hand the horrendous damage the common fisheries policy has done, not just with the marine resource, the environment, but the coastal communities. What's Brexit going to do for the marine environment and for our fishing communities?
Booker?
I must immediately say, you've just been listening to one of the real heroes of this whole battle. John Ashworth, back in the early 90s, who made trawler doors and other things up in Yorkshire, started a thing called Save Britain's Fish with one or two other fishermen to protest at the utter catastrophe that was being wrought on the British fishing industry as a result of the totally dishonest, cynical way in which Edward Heath, back in 1972, agreed that even though, I must take it back another stage, what even Heath didn't have a clue of was that when Britain, Denmark, Ireland and Norway all applied to join the EU, the French, particularly in Brussels, recognised that these four countries had most of the richer fishing waters in Western Europe. And they proposed that if these countries were to be allowed in, before their applications were lodged, they should declare a new rule that all the waters, the fishing waters around the western coast of Europe, should be regarded as a common European resource. No one had thought of this before. There was no provision in the European Treaty, the Treaty of Rome, to allow for this to happen. No power had been given to Brussels. I went out under the 30-year rule to Q to look at the Foreign Office papers for 1971, and the most fascinating document I found in many was a 17-page legal opinion by the lawyers for the Council of Ministers in Brussels, who had been asked, if we want to seize the fishing waters of Europe as a common European resource, what article in the treaty would allow us to do this legally?
And there wasn't
The
one.
lawyers said, they looked at one article after another, and they concluded that there wasn't a single article which could cover what was being proposed. But there was an article, Article 235 in those days, which we called the catch-all, which said, if anything that Brussels needs to do isn't covered by any of the rest of the treaty, this article allows us, if it is in the spirit of the treaty, this will allow us to do it. And that was one of the articles they used to produce what was in effect a totally illegal proposal that the fishing waters of Western Europe should be seized. And we know what happened. We had at that time the most successful fishing industry in Europe. Admittedly, a lot of it's because it was long distance over to Greenland and Iceland, and there were other reasons why that collapsed. But the point was, what followed from Heath's utterly disgraceful... I would talk to a guy who was in the room when this came up. They knew in 10 Downing Street in 1972 what was being proposed. They knew that it would be incredibly damaging to the British fishing industry. And Mr. Heath, as he then was, asked, how many fishermen are there? Well, there are 22,000 there's about 22,000 active fishermen. Well, they're politically insignificant. We should go ahead. And he sent his minister, Geoffrey Rippon, his minister for Europe, to tell a couple of direct lies to the House of Commons about how much we'd given away.
Yeah.
Now, the reason why I said all that is because it is one of the most extraordinary examples of utter dishonesty of this ghastly thing that we joined 40 years ago. And the one man who, more than anyone else, tried to raise this back in the early 90s, through the fishing communities, through the fishing news every week, was that chap we've just heard, John Ashworth. He was, that's why I say he was a real hero. And he, when I started to read what he was writing in Fishing News, and of course eventually I met him, I thought this is the one guy who, and with his 2 or 3 friends, and real allies, is trying to point out one of the most disgraceful things that has ever been done by any government of this country in history.
So we're going for one more question.
Good evening and good afternoon. I'd like to remind everybody, I'm sure none of you have forgotten, that today is the 23rd of April, and it's St. George's Day, and that's England. And it's not perhaps happenstance that you've decided to hold the meeting today as well. My name's Harold Hoffman. I've been at this on and off since 1972, 73. I was the political agent for the late Christopher Fair-Smith, and as the Anti-Common Market League, and we polled in Marylebone under fighting Lord Hailsham, 300 votes. And I'm pleased to see that today we've got many more supporters for getting out of the EU. However, my questions are 2 or 3-fold. First of all, to Christopher as well as to you, Richard. Isn't it frustrating for you not to be exposed to the mainstream media at all? And I'd like a response from you on that. How difficult has it been to get any response for you being invited on any of the BBC or ITV programmes, and Mr. Dimbleby, etc.? And secondly, in a long conversation I had with Richard and the importance of the Lisbon Treaty, Cameron, or Camophony as I call him, is surely duty-bound once the European Council were incorporated into the governance processes of the EU, that he can't. He sits on 2 fences, according to my understanding, whereby when there is an issue pertaining to the interests of the United Kingdom, he has to support the interests of the European Union. And I'd like and appreciate your comments on that aspect of the Lisbon Treaty. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, obviously we haven't got much time left. I think one interesting difference between this referendum and the one in 1975, can I just ask people in this room to raise their, who voted to stay in 1975? Those are old enough to do so. I did too. Who voted to get out? So, pretty balanced.
I was in Africa at the time, I was old.
No, the point I was going to make, yeah, well, that was quite interesting. I think quite a lot of people who voted to stay in 1975, like me, will be voting differently this time. But I think one difference, I think the reason why I voted to stay in was because I couldn't believe in 1975 that the two most prominent supporters of the Out campaign, Tony Benn and Enoch Powell, I thought, these guys can't talk sense. Looking back, because they were, they stood out above the crowd. One was very left-wing, the other was very right-wing, as it were, and I thought, no, we can't go along with them. 40 years later, you look back to what they were actually saying, those two guys. They were the only guys who were really telling. Tony Benn's most wonderful summing up, the whole thing was a coup d'etat, a slow-motion coup d'etat. He was absolutely right. That's exactly what taking us into the common market was, in every possible way. But there is a difference between the two referendums. In 1975, not only do you have all the main political parties for staying in, you also had almost total unanimity from the media. Of course, we know which side the BBC is on, but all the newspapers, with a couple of exceptions, minor exceptions. This time, we have got, from certain newspapers in particular, Daily Mail and even Daily Telegraph, we have got far more critical comment this time. We've got columnists lined up wall to wall almost. You think of people like Richard Littlejohn and Charles Moore and so on. You didn't have that in 1975. So whatever the politicians, the political class is doing, and admittedly there are a few people like Michael Gove, as we know, but the balance of the debate has shifted in terms of the media. Even the BBC sort of vaguely tries to be sometimes a bit impartial. Did anyone see those the two ghastly programmes by Nick Robinson?
Yes.
Which actually, the best bits of them are all from a series that was made 20 years ago, called The Poison Chalice. But I've written about it in my column tomorrow, so I won't go on about that. But we have got a real problem. It's going to be very interesting to see what all these papers like the Daily Mail say on the day before the poll. Are they going to say, having rubbished the EU in every conceivable way for the last 3 months and up to June 23rd, are they going to say, despite that, we do think on balance that probably it would be safer to stay in? That's going to be interesting. I suspect that one or two of them won't say that. They will say we should vote to leave.
Okay, and thank you very much indeed for that. That answers, concludes the question and answer session, and thank you very much indeed for all staying to the end and asking them. I'd like you to show your appreciation to Richard and to Christopher for coming down today and being here with us. So if you can show your appreciation, please.